Good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started as folks continue to join us, and just want to welcome everyone to this meeting, Learning from the March, a virtual sharing session with Minnesota clergy organizers. Everyone will be on mute because of the number of folks who registered for tonight, which was a large group. So that's how we're going to proceed from the outset. And from the top, I'd like to say that we are recording this session for resource purposes. And we will see how or if that is shared out, but we will stop the recording at the Q&A portion of the meeting. But we will be recording the presentation for right now. And so my name is Megan Bergert, and I work with the Global Hope team at the national setting of the United Church of Christ in Cleveland. And my role is Minister for Refugee and Migration Services. And I'm so pleased to be with you all tonight and to welcome our presenters who are joining us from mostly Minnesota. One is in transit, doing all sorts of things. Everybody is very busy, but has really graciously shared their time with us tonight. And so, again, I would invite you as we begin tonight, just to kind of go down our run of show here. We're going to start with some introductions. I'm going to share some of the training material from the March call to clergy for training that occurred, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now. And then we're going to have some questions and time for sharing from the clergy who are gathered with us. And then we will have time for some Q&A. So as questions come up for you, I'd invite you to put them in the chat, and we're going to be going through those and monitoring those throughout the presentation. We may not get to them all, but hopefully we'll get to a lot of them. So with that, I'd like to invite our presenters to introduce themselves. And I think we'll start with T. Michael Rock, if you could introduce yourself and where you're located and anything else you'd like to share.
Thanks. I'm Team Michael Rock. It's great to see some very beautiful people on the screen. Many of I know and many I don't. I get to serve at Lindale UCC with the amazing Rebecca Vocal. So we're co-pastors there. And I also serve at United Theological Seminary as a formation direction professor. And I'm here in my basement on the north side of Minneapolis, Dakota land.
Great. Thank you, T. Michael. Susie.
Hey, everybody. I'm Reverend Susie Hayward. I serve as the Minister of Justice and Formation at Creekside UCC on the south side of Minneapolis. I'm a Minnesota girl, born and raised, but I spent 26 years living on the East Coast before coming back to Minnesota in 2020. I'll hand it over to Leslie.
Hi, everyone. I am Leslie Moody, and I am the pastor at First Congregational UCC in Brainerd, Minnesota, which is about 2.5 hours north of the Twin Cities, right in the middle of the state. And been there about 11 years, and forward to sharing and learning both tonight. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Leslie. Rebecca.
Hey everybody, I'm Rebecca Vocal, and I also get to serve with the great T. Michael Rock at Lindale UCC. And I am also on the steering committee for March, Multi-Faith, Anti-Racism, Change and Healing. And I think that's kind of an important piece for tonight's discussion. And I live in South Minneapolis on Dakota land. And Tanya.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I am in transit from Wisconsin to Minnesota at the end of our civil rights trip, where we made a pilgrimage to Memphis, Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham. And boy, howdy, let me tell you, we have so many similarities to talk about. My role, however, in the United Church of Christ is I am the conference minister of the UCC in Minnesota. And will speak to that role a little bit in dealing with the present circumstances that Minnesota and many of our clergy have been working very hard for now well over a month, 6, 7 weeks, right? It's been a long time. So that's who I am. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Tanya. I think I got all of our presenters, I believe. And again, just welcome all of you as people continue to enter. I'll just say once more that we are recording the presentation portion of the session, but will not be recording any questions and answers that we get into later. So the first thing that we wanted to do before really our presenters have time to share so much of their experience is I just wanted to share some slides with some key points from the March training that occurred as it was 2 weeks ago, right? It's hard to tell at this point. And I know that some of our attendees here were there as well, and that might be something interesting to bring up later in our discussion or our questions. But just to give us kind of a grounding of some of the important organizing principles. Thank you, Rebecca. It was January 22nd, the March training. Just to share some of those strategic organizing points, just wanted to share some of those before we get into our discussion. So Andrea, if you could share our slides. First, wanted to make sure you all had the website for March, which Rebecca mentioned, and I think we'll certainly learn more about tonight, but I would really invite you to go to their website, Multi-Faith Anti-Racism Change and Healing. And I just pulled this slide directly from the website and the call that they put out for the clergy to join for the training and to help amplify and lift up what was going on in Minneapolis. And for those of us who are there to take those learnings back to our own communities, which is another purpose for our call tonight. And so I'd invite you to read this on your own. I'll be sharing out the slides after the call. But I think that some important points here is, just from the beginning paragraph there, no Americans without responsibility for the growing, there are over 3,000 people detained right now all over the country, and growing number of people kidnapped and missing from our communities, and for, as we know, Renee Good and Alex Preddy's murders and the 32 other people who were killed in ICE detention, who died in ICE detention in 2025. And so I'm going to go to the next slide here. And these were three, really, there's so much content here, but trying to put it really succinctly, one of the great statements was at the top of those boxes: resisting authoritarianism requires trained, sustained resistance grounded in truth-telling and faithful witness. And so one of those points is that resistance must be trained. It's not spontaneous. It's learned, practiced, disciplined. And this is something I sure have been sharing out in any of the discussions that I've been having since returning from Minneapolis, is such a huge part of why the Minneapolis action in surrounding areas has had such incredible impact, is because those relationships were formed for coalition building, and people were ready. No one had decided that justice has been done and now we can relax. And so people need to be prepared to show up. Grounding comes before action, and relationship and coalition building is key. And I know our presenters will talk about that a little bit more. That second pillar, sustained action, matters more than one day action. So it's more than a single moment. Democratic backsliding is a process. Authoritarianism counts on exhaustion. And I know that some of our presenters are going to talk about ways that they really face and respond to the inevitable exhaustion of this sustained organizing and action and response, and all of the sadness and anger and attendant emotions that go with that. And someone at the March training in the morning said this, and I thought it was a great framework for us to be engaging in this work, and that is this time is urgent not because everything is lost, but because everything is being tested. And I think we've certainly seen that in Minneapolis, that there has been some response on the national stage and in people's hearts and minds about what is possible throughout the United States, seeing what's happening in Minneapolis and other places. And then the last pillar I just point to is non-cooperation is a moral strategy. Non-cooperative direct action is how communities withdraw consent from unjust systems. The goal is not seeking chaos or attention. The goal is refusing to legitimize harm. That's very important. And then a really interesting point, I think, is that rather than talking about, this is one perspective, rather than talking about protesters or protest, consider using more of the terminology of neighbor, showing up for your neighbors. And of course, we can think about neighbors in all sorts of expansive ways, but starting certainly with the people in your neighborhood, in your community, in your city. Um, so I think that the language, thinking about the language that we're using, is a really important point of reflection. Um, and then the last thing I think I'll share right now is the 4 conditions of successful movements against authoritarianism. And at the March training and probably some other things you all have been engaged in, other trainings or discussions, there are statistics that are talked about how many people in a population it takes to prop up a declining democracy or resist authoritarianism. Um, and those are really interesting and great for reflection. And I would just point to these broad concepts that movements have to keep growing. The movement always needs more people. You continue to adapt and expand with creative tactics. And I think our presenters will probably talk a little bit about that tonight. The way that, boy, Minneapolis sure has come up with creative tactics and done things that were probably unexpected for the opposition. And to build resilience in the face of oppression, mass noncompliance that's nonviolent is more joinable. So again, going back to that growing the movement. And also the last one, this is difficult, but we're going to talk about this a little bit more. We need to conceive of spaces that can welcome those we disagree with and can absorb that disagreement. So some of us may be working in spaces that are pretty ideologically aligned. Probably a lot of us aren't. And so this is, I think, a really important, challenging and important concept that we'll talk about a little bit more. And then I just wanted to share the demands that were, that were released by March in a really striking visual and also very clearly stated, which is, I think, a lesson that we can, all of us can be taking learnings from. A personal change is not justice. Demands from Minnesota call for real accountability and safety. And so then here were the 4 demands. ICE must leave Minnesota now. Any officer who kills a civilian must be held legally accountable. No additional federal funding for ICE in the upcoming congressional budget, which I'm sure we've all seen is really a matter that's being contested right now. And then demand 4, all businesses cease economic relations with ICE and refuse ICE entry or use of their property for staging grounds. I'm not sure if any of these demands have changed in about the last week since I pulled this from their material. They may have, but this is, I think, a really great example of clarity of message. And that's something that, as somebody just who attended the training, was really striking about March. The clarity and the through line in their messaging and how well that was communicated out to folks who attended the training. So Andrea, I think that is the last slide I'm going to share for right now, so we can take those away. Thank you so much. And I think that what we'll do first is just start into some of our questions for our presenters. And I'm going to ask them to just sort of jump in, and I think multiple people will have some additions for each question. But I'm going to start with what I anticipate might be a question that a lot of us have in our minds right now. How did you know it was time to prepare for ICE in your city, in your town, in your place of living? I think a lot of us have been hearing, ICE says they're going to go here next, they're going to go here next. There's a large immigration population where I live, so they're sure to come here next. But how did you know it was time to really prepare? And so I'd invite any of our presenters to jump in on that question.
I
I
call him
can.
Rebecca.
Oh, T, did you call in Rebecca?
Yeah.
No, I think Susie, you were just going to
This is
jump
a
in.
Minnesota thing, Megan, that none of us will ever. We're too polite to jump in.
Right.
So
I'm just
you
going to
might
start
have to
calling.
have a
I'm going to
heavier
start
hand
calling on
there.
people. Okay.
Rebecca.
There are two answers to this question. On the one hand, the part of what has allowed us to be prepared for this moment is actually the particular history here in the Twin Cities, and there are sort of a confluence of several things. One of which is this long history of really deep and wide indigenous organizing. The American Indian movement was founded here. We often talk about the sacred confluence of the Minnesota and the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, known as Bedote, is the site of creation, and it is also the site of the concentration camp during the U.S. Dakota War, and the site of kind of genesis and genocide, and the Whipple building, which is the site of deportation and the detention center here in Minnesota, is less than half a mile from that Bedote site. And then the history of Jamar Clark and Philando Castile and George Floyd, that there is a way in which there is this pro-LGBT, multi-faith movement in followership and solidarity with Black and Brown and Indigenous leadership. That there is a way in which we have been preparing for this moment. And on the other hand, we knew that we had a Somali candidate for mayor, and there was speculation that he was going to win the mayoral election, and so the plans for targeting Minneapolis have been have been in effect for a while, and so I think that both the long and deep relationships, and the experience of organizing here, and the reality of Tim Walz as the VP candidate in 2024, who are mayoral, like we knew it was a matter of time. So who else would like join me in your analysis, Susie and T and others?
I can jump on that. I think also we knew Minnesota might be a juicy target for the administration as soon as the new administration began. So in some ways, all of the foundational work, yes, that Rebecca spoke to, and also December 2024, I would say we began to prepare for the potential for Minnesota to be a target for some of the reasons Rebecca said. I think also retribution for the uprising that happened here, a recognition of the power of organizing here. And I mean, not only the reckoning after George Floyd's murder, but the fact that it led to successful accountability. Derek Chauvin is still behind bars. And so there was a sense, even as early as December, before Trump was even in office, that we needed to prepare as Minnesota for a potential crackdown or assault against us. And I actually think there was even a little bit of a power calculation by those in power that if you could subjugate Minnesota, then you could subjugate the rest of the country, recognizing the power of organizing that exists here and recognizing the fact that it doesn't fit the neat narratives of the administration, in terms of like you can call the coasts like not real America, right? But you can't do that as easily with the Midwest. We are salt of the earth. We are the Scandinavian immigrants, the white folks that Trump likes to say he lifts up. I bet he regrets that now. that he's facing all these descendants of Norwegians alongside their Black and Brown and Indigenous neighbors, um, and their neighborliness. So we started then, and then I would say tactically also with respect to ICE specifically, in the summer is when we really began to have the legal observer trainings, and they began in oftentimes in houses of worship. I think we held one at our church in the summer. We were talking about them at our roundtables of faith communities who organize around immigrant rights over the summer, and those trainings were multiplying as we went into the early fall, and they were becoming more robust too, to the point where sanctuaries were overflowing and synagogues were overflowing that were hosting them. And I think at this point now the latest that I saw was over 30,000 Minnesotans have been trained in these legal observer rights.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Perfect. I will only add that part of that coalition building was with Unidos and MIRAC and other immigrant rights action groups that we've been in relationship with for a decade or more. These are not new relationships. In the church, the white church, ceded the leadership of those trainings to the folks who were good at it, and where it was going to affect their communities and where they knew people, and they kind of used our faith communities to do the trainings because it was a safe haven, but it was these big multi-coalition gatherings to make that happen. So, and I would include, to Rebecca's organizing background and history of Minnesota, is Line 3 and Dakota Action stuff and Standing Rock, and these were coalescing moments for our local organizing community. So relationships were being built long before the election, and we just coalesced together to face whatever was going to come. And the other lightning rod besides Walls is Ilhan Omar, who has been a bane in the administration side for the 5 years or whatever, how low. Yeah, so.
Thank you for that too, Michael. I want to come back to what you said in a minute with our next question, but Rebecca, go ahead, and then I'm going to ask Leslie to add her perspective.
Sorry, Leslie. The only other thing I would add is that part of the network that was built in the first Trump administration around sanctuary and sanctuary supporting was able to be, reignited, and so. I mean, in terms of what lessons you all might be taking from us is, what are the past coalitional spaces between frontline communities and religious communities? And I think that don't forget the work of unions and what is the work that you're doing in coalition with unions as well.
That's an important point. We heard about that. I think probably at least some of the folks on the call have heard about the work of Chenoweth and forgetting the other scholar right now. Please feel free to
Maria
jump
Stefan.
in. Thank you. And the work that they've done looking at the history of movements, both violent opposition and nonviolent opposition against authoritarian control of governments, and their findings, just an incredible increase in success of rising against pushing back authoritarian movements when labor is involved. And
the actual statistic, Megan, if I can
yes,
offer it, is that 52% of nonviolent resistance movements are successful if they are sustained and disciplined, to go back to the slide that Megan showed earlier. And if you add in the involvement of unions and labor, it jumps up to 84%. So it's a huge boost to the effectiveness, especially when it comes to doing strikes and boycotts and putting the economic pressure that wannabe authoritarians depend on in order to prop themselves up, to have those labor relationships. Of course, in the US, we have a bit of a challenge because the labor movement has faced such pushback and challenges and sustained weakening that has been orchestrated over decades. But it's still very present, very alive, and I think being revitalized right now. And so the involvement of labor has been key here in Minnesota. And look at the national level too. There is, we talk about working very locally and even hyper locally here, block to block in Minneapolis. And yes, there is that. And there's also the watching for what's happening at the regional and the national level and plugging in and out of that because this is happening at a national and federal level. And so we need to have the mass resistance as well, and the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And so watch at the national level for the labor unions are organizing for May Day. And you can actually, I'll find the URL and I'll drop it into the chat for you and encourage everybody to be thinking about how at the local level you can plug into that national strike that is being organized for May Day.
Thank you, Susie. That's incredibly helpful. And thank you for those details. I know that Freedom Trainers is one site where they have a lot of this information that we've just been discussing. And that will be part of the, oh, great. Susie just put the link in there. But they were, a Freedom Trainer was there in March and the training and was incredibly, I think, impactful. And they just have that site has so much to offer as far as resources. So I think that the way our conversation has gone here, if we could sort of talk a little bit more about the next question with those in Minneapolis, so T. Michael and Rebecca and Susie, and then I want to turn Leslie to your perspective outside of Minneapolis. So you're talking about, a lot of folks in Minneapolis had these connections. There was this coalition building. There's a history of that. And so how did it work for you all in that setting when you had been doing that work? You faced these incredibly violent, moments, historical moments in U.S. history in your setting already. When you had that sense that ICE was coming, which you described, that was something going to be like the next spate of violence that Minneapolis was going to be facing. Whom did you turn to? How did you have all of these community partners, you have these connections, you have this coalition building, but how did that start to coalesce around this response to ICE? And then if you could talk about that in Minneapolis a little bit, and then Leslie, I want to turn to you after that to talk about, again, outside of that urban setting of Minneapolis. So maybe Rebecca, given your leadership in March, could you kick off that part of the addressing that question?
Sure, and I'll look to Susie and T. Michael to have my back for what I forget. Well, I think just to reiterate the point that as a coalitional space, March has been around since 1991. And we have this sort of muscle of, we spent the first 20 or 22 years mostly focusing on pro-LGBT, multi-faith support in Minnesota, and we're active in the marriage campaign. And when Michael Brown was murdered, we made the decision to kind of shift into kind of faithful followership of the movement for Black Lives. And as T. Michael said, besides Jamar Clark and Philando Castile, also Standing Rock and the Line 3 here in Minnesota. So part of we have been in relationship, and when the election results in 24 happened, we literally held a series of meetings in December and January of 24-25, knowing that this was going to happen. And part of our model is really how do we bring our multi-faith communities into followership with frontline communities. And so the out of that kind of deep relationship, it was who are the immigrant right organizations that are holding these trainings? How can we welcome them into our church buildings? How can we be preparing our sanctuary committees or our immigrant welcoming committees to respond to this moment? How are we? A lot of that sort of reinvigorating relationship, and as Susie has said, just the number of trainings that we have hosted, I can't tell you. And a lot of it has been, how can our church members show up and provide hospitality to the frontline community trainers. Susie, T. Michael, what else would you say?
Yeah, absolutely to all that, 100%. I think we're all three of us have been in this movement since we started thinking about serving in ministry in some way. Peace building, coalition building is part of our call to ministry. Rebecca and I have been in and out of each other's lives and orbits since we were teenagers in the UCC, hanging out and having mentors in that space to say, the world needs your voice. It's on fire, and it was on fire in the 80s and 90s, and it's not ended. We were prepared because we've always been being prepared for the next thing that happens. The UCC coalition building ethos is covenant, right? Covenant and accountability. Part of that covenantal nature is to stand on the side of those most oppressed and to be on the margins and to get the trainings and to be prepared for the next horrible authoritarian fascist thing that's going to come in a system that we all are a part of, that is married to militarism, consumerism, racism, all the isms. And so this is part of who we are as UCC clergy. It's in our bones. So we're always prepared for the next thing. And I hope that's true of everybody in this call, that we spend less time in church offices and more time in the streets, no matter what church we serve in. And so I would say that it goes well beyond the uprisings and pieces of our Minnesota history, but it happens everywhere we've ever served, all three of us, in any situation, in any calling, preparing ourselves to be on the margins with people who are actively being taken and disappeared, because that is not a new thing. And so we're active in the boarding school movement to help our Indigenous friends find their own voice after a horrible colonization effort and so many other things, right? So I just wanted to, broaden and challenge our UCC friends in this UCC call.
And I would broaden it even further to say so I was ordained to the work of religious peace building, which I did for most of my early part of my ministry in Iraq, in Colombia, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and other places around the world. And now I'm doing it here in Minneapolis. But one thing that I found very useful is to consult with and learn from beloveds around the world who have been fighting exclusionary supremacist religious nationalism, have been fighting to protect democracy and won in places like Brazil and Sri Lanka and South Korea, and to learn from them. So to kind of shatter the American exceptionalist notion that we know how to do democracy best, clearly we're not doing so well right now. And maybe we have something to learn from other folks who have protected democracy when the stakes are high. So what can we learn from those folks? Also, just getting into some of the nitty-gritty and the reality, we did consultations with a lot of lawyers in order to understand how different faith spaces are protected and where in different houses of worship are protected. We got some good guidance from Heather at the UCC about that, our general counsel. But we also consulted with local lawyers and immigration lawyers and so on about those things. Freedom Trainers, I put the material or the link in there for some of their material, but they actually offer trainings. And so some of us from March went and spent a week doing a TOT with Freedom Trainers, and that was really helpful in order to understand how the sort of strategic aspects of mobilizing, but also how to frame it in ways that are going to be understandable and digestible to our members and to the broader community. We also did some consulting, frankly, with Jewish community members and Muslim community members about risk assessment. White majority churches have not had to face a lot of questions of repression or violence in their houses of worship. But the reality here in Minnesota now, and I think this is true in other places around the country and could potentially grow, is that we need to be thinking like our Jewish beloveds and our Muslim beloveds and our Sikh and other beloveds have for a long time about how do you balance the wanting to have your doors flung wide open to the community for those who are seeking mercy and sanctuary and soul care, and balance that with the need to have a space that is safe, especially for vulnerable members. And as places of worship are no longer protected as sensitive locations, because that was rescinded by the Trump administration, and recognizing that some of our churches are out there as prophetic, progressive voices that are standing with immigrant neighbors, standing with queer community members, and so on. How do we learn from communities, other religious communities that have been thinking about this for a long time?
M- Megan, could I add one other piece of
Please do. Please.
preparation and content? Well, I think the other piece that I do the other part of my life is working on a program called Sacred Reckonings, White Settler Colonizer Churches Doing the Work of Reparation. And the Proctor Institute in July of 2024 did a webinar specifically on Project 2025. And Bishop Joseph Tolton, who's a leader in the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, who's an African American gay man who does work in East Africa, made the comment that this kind of moment, that Project 2025, the New Apostolic Reformation, the Seven Mountain Mandate, that kind of overlapping Venn diagram of white Christian nationalism is simply a modern rearticulation of the doctrine of discovery. And I feel a particular responsibility, and I feel like the United Church of Christ has done some good work around repudiating the doctrine of discovery. I see Sherry Prestaman here on the call, and I know that she was president at Standing Rock as we sort of talked about the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. And the framework of how it is that we are doing truth telling and confession, repentance, repair work, and the ways in which that kind of work is absolutely necessary in this moment. And the practice of followership and solidarity of frontline communities is an embodiment, is a kind of incarnation of that repertory kind of work. And I think it's important for us to be bringing our theological reflection around the work of confession, repentance, and repair, truth telling, into this particular moment, and really drawing on the best of our kind of liberative theological traditions in the UCC.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm sure there are a lot of heads nodding at home and a lot of interest, and some folks are adding some comments in the chat, which is great. And so I would say at this point, um, let's broaden the conversation even more as we talk about kind of zooming out and broadening our perspective. And I'd like to turn to Leslie. We're going to get into in a little bit sort of how we approach and can live into that training point from March about creating spaces that can absorb disagreement. But I think that there are probably folks on the call, and certainly in the life of the UCC, for whom these concepts may be unfamiliar, or they may not be as welcomed in their spaces, the spaces in which they move. And to Leslie, I'd like to talk about just if you're outside of a setting And Leslie, I'd invite you in just a second to talk about your location in Minnesota and maybe how it differs, or the different kind of setting and context in which you're working. But how do we see different entry points just pragmatically in this conversation for folks who aren't as keyed into the workings of ICE and maybe couldn't see that coming down the highway as clearly as others could? Um, and what are we, how are those in those settings approaching this time now? Because so many across all sorts of differences, I think right now are saying, oh, this might be impacting us, or how could this be impacting us, or people in our community? This isn't what I thought it was going to be. So Leslie, could you talk a little bit about your experience?
Yeah. So a little bit about my context. The Brainerd, what's called the Brainerd Lakes area. Brainerd itself is about 14,000 people. So a little different than the metro area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which I had to look up. Like when you talk about the Twin Cities metro is something like 3.5 million people if you look at all of the suburbs, um, and Minneapolis itself about 500,000. The whole Brainerd Lakes area is still less than 100,000. And another key difference is we voted for Trump, not me personally, but that area of the state, by a lot. And so being in a context where the local folks predominantly, we assume, like the assumption is like if you look at, if you're next to somebody at the grocery store, they've probably voted for Trump. And that's not true of my church. My congregation is kind of a progressive oasis in the middle of this sea of conservatism. And it is a refuge for folks too whose families are Trumpers or whose one of my lay leaders talked about how she's hearing from her coworkers still to this day about what she had somebody comment about how he thought it would be fun to work for ICE. And so the water in which my parishioners are swimming is difficult just to, she was talking about the difficulty of standing up for herself and for what she thought was right, and that she kind of just keeps her head down because she doesn't want to lose her job. And so it's a little bit different in that regard. And so when I shared with Megan earlier that when the call for showing up to the March event in Minneapolis came through, my thought was, I'm going to go and support the people of Minneapolis, that I am going to, I'm only 2 hours away. There are people flying from all the different states across the country, and how can I say no when it's for me just a drive? And so I went thinking that that was going to be my primary job. And what I learned was that what I found out later was that I was being prepared for ICE showing up literally the next day, that Monday, made arrest of 4 local folks who were owners and employees of a local Mexican restaurant in Brainerd. And one of the things that I took away from, the slides were great and they're very good, like higher level authoritarianism. How do we fight authoritarianism? There was a panel that was that I attended of people who were sharing their experience of how, this time, how they've responded in this time. And one of the women that was talking said, when the call comes to you, say yes. And that hit me in a way that other things didn't. And it was simple. And she said, sometimes we hesitate because we don't have the map. We don't have the answers. We don't know exactly what we're going to do. And as somebody who really likes to see the whole picture from start to finish and know that I'm going to do it right, saying yes when the path is unclear is really scary and hard. And so when I got a call from our local Indivisible chapter, that just letting me know about this arrest that had happened, and would I put together a vigil for the community that night in front of the restaurant? And I said yes. And then I went, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. And also learning, the March event taught me a lot about like how to not explicitly, but just in the way that they prepared us, the sensitivity that needs to be taken when we are doing this kind of work. And so I didn't post it on social media. I didn't, so we didn't have a huge turnout because that wasn't the point. The point was to show up for our neighbors. And so we had 20 or 30 people that on 4 or 5 hours notice, some of them less than that, show up, and we sang and lit candles, and some people brought signs that they left for, signs of support that they left for the restaurant. And a woman came out and in tears and said, "We're not terrible people. We're not drug dealers. We just want to live and be left alone," and it really mattered. And what ended up happening then was that, yes, that answering that one call then led to lots of other doors opening, and people coming to me. And then I was interviewed by different media channels, and so then now folks are reaching out to me. But then the knowledge that I gained from March and from that training has enabled me to see what's some of the local response of people who, like myself, but maybe even more so, definitely more so, are very caught off guard. And, the folks like Rebecca and T. Michael and y'all talking about, you saw this coming a year ago. My folks are shocked. Not everybody, but that's something that happens in the cities, or that's something that happens at, the big agriculture plants, or that's something that happens. There was a meatpacking plant that got raided. And so we've shown up in support, but it's always been somewhere else. And my thought, and I talked about this with some folks that I met in the cities, that Brainerd is a very tourist heavy, hospitality driven area. We have, lakes galore and resorts, and we typically have a lot of international workers during the summer. And my thought was, once summer hits, then maybe we'll see some activity. And that wasn't the case. And so knowing that it was that question about when did I know that it was time to prepare, I told Megan, I didn't realize it was time to prepare. And part of me felt foolish and naive in not thinking that. And I reached out to our local Indivisible chapter. One of the leaders is a member of my church. And I said, "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to wake up. And I'm here. Like, what can I do?" And I think part of it I look at as a real blessing, because I've been able to take this time to really discern what my role is and what our community's role is. And it's different than it may be in a bigger metropolitan area, because we don't have the population or the support and the network of folks to do the type of rapid response that can be done in a big metro area where the population density is close, and where your neighbors are, your neighbors. You don't have or you get to know your neighbors. And so one of the things that I walked away from was the importance of building those relationships and building them now before you need them, and knowing your neighbors, building your neighbors. And so I'm looking at what can my little church do in this little space. And something that I have done is helped the local community, where they are well-intentioned liberal white folks trying to help without tools. And so that idea of a trained resistance and a trained response, being able to teach them the importance of that, that just driving around looking for suspicious vehicles and suspicious people is not helpful. And talking about your plans on Facebook is not a secure channel. And so encouraging folks to get trained as observers, and encouraging folks to get trained and vetted for rapid response, and figuring out how we as a more rural community can show up. And things like I'm realizing that something that we can do is just open our space. And I took that partially from All Nations Church, that is doing like community care times, and other spaces. I have a parishioner that is doing translation in the local jail because our county sheriff is cooperating with ICE. And so we have multiple ICE detainees in the Crow Wing County Jail, and most of them are not from Crow Wing County, but she's doing their translation. And so she's coming out of that experience horrified and raw and needing more support than she's getting. And so having a space where people can come at least once a week and just rest and unplug and pray, meditate, just be around other people. And I presented that to our Christian, what we call our Christian ministry committee. And I said, this is something I think we should do. What do you think? And they loved it. And then I said, well, I said, this Tuesday is probably too soon, right? Do we want some time to plan? And immediately, like, no, we need to do this now. Like, they overrode my sense of, I want to get it right. Right. So nope. So they said, yes, they're listening to my sermons. I appreciate that. I need to listen to my own sermons. And so, yeah, so we met Thursday or Wednesday Thursday. We met Thursday, and this Tuesday will be our first, what we're calling community soul care. So I imagine that will expand. And so the other piece that I'm trying to do is build my network of who are the local clergy that are wanting to get involved, who want to get connected. And it's fascinating how, and this is a God moment for me, where I started putting this out into the universe, sent an email to the clergy that I knew, and then a chaplain I'd never met before walked in 20 minutes later and said, I've heard that this church is really progressive and active. I'm wondering if you know how I might get involved. And I was like, your timing is impeccable. And so now he's, showing up at trainings, and he's still finding his way. He's not, one of the things that I think is really important, and you all probably, many of you know this already, but movements take multiple gifts and multiple ways of showing up, and not everybody is going to be the ones getting arrested or the ones doing nonviolent non-cooperation. And those are important pieces, but they're not the only pieces. And so, some of us showing up just at vigils, or showing up and, we're another yes that was or an opportunity was presented to our congregation, was our local Indivisible chapter putting together some resources and needing space. And did we have the space for this need that they had? And I said, absolutely. And she goes, do you need to check with the council? And I said, nope, I'm going to ask for forgiveness. Council's not for 2 more weeks. Like, we're going to do this. We have plenty of space. I did end up sending an email just to like, hey, by the way, and then said, this moment, I said to my council, this moment may require some more nimble response. And I hope that you will trust me to say yes when I need to. And to know when are the times that I have to check in, when are the times that I really need that consensus, and when are the times I just need to do what I think we're being called to do. And they were so supportive, and I'm blessed to be in a congregation that was all on board with that. So that's a really high level, low or deep, I don't know what it is. That was a long, but that's where I'm at.
That's great,
And
Leslie.
I'm happy to zero in on any of those things. But
Thanks,
Well,
Leslie. I just want to add one thing. Uh, Back in February, when inauguration time happened, and there was a threat to deport all immigrants, and there were 14 churches in northern Iowa. So yay, northern Iowa. Ecumenical connections that had me in for a training because there's a lot of meatpacking plants in northern Iowa, and they wanted to protect their neighbors. So they all got 120 people came out for a training back in February, knowing this may happen. And what happened there was just more and more coalition building. They developed trust with some of the Spanish-speaking churches of different denominations they never had before. The progressive churches talked with the conservative churches, and they had a sense of care for their neighbors in a way that was unexpected to the organizers. And they're just prepared well in advance. So it goes back to the other question, but it's also in every community. Know who your people are, know where the risks are, and meet that need as much as we can. It's just how the gospel gets lived out in people's lives. So, and there's great trainers all over the country to make that kind of thing happen, which is what we found and what I think happens all over the place. So,
Megan, I would like to jump in here for
Oh,
a couple
good.
minutes.
Tanya, I was gonna ask you to do so because I wanted to just highlight a couple things that I think you could speak more to from what Leslie said, and that was the Ministry of Presence. These are things that you and I talked about in the time we spent in Minneapolis, not doing things perfectly or feeling like we're not doing enough or we're late and late entry. Um, Saying yes, and then that exhaustion and also building community. So those are disparate things all over the page, but I know especially in your position, you've thought deeply and acted, um, widely in providing care for folks. So please go ahead with what you'd like to share.
Thank you so much for organizing us, Megan, and inviting us into the call. There's a lot of things I want to point to, but one of the things I want to acknowledge is that not all of us are made for the first responder role. Not all of us are going to show up and be the whistleblowers or the mutual aid deliverers. But each of us has good to do. And we have to figure out what that good is that we have to do in our present circumstances. The other thing I want to say is that T. Michael and Rebecca and Susie have known each other a long time. And Leslie, you're just doing such amazing work. I'm very proud of you in the location where you are. You've done fantastic. Please don't think you came late to the party. You didn't. You responded in exactly the perfect timing that you needed to do that. I arrived in the position of the conference minister of the Minnesota UCC on November 3rd. When you ask the question about when did you know something was coming, in my case, I knew that we were going to be targeted quickly in my early term because I wrote a piece on December 5th. So a month after I arrived, I wrote a piece denouncing the attacks on our Somali neighbors. So we knew when President Trump began speaking specifically against the Somali people of Minnesota that it was going to happen imminently. So what I want to talk about just a little bit is the power of cultivating hope in the midst of very challenging, desperate, and sometimes extremely exhausting circumstances. That having those people in your community that are hope cultivators is critical for sustaining this movement long term, because this is not a one-time quick thing, right? So we need to figure out who are the people that are going to cultivate those hopeful responses for us. So one of the things that I did immediately is, without hesitation and without checking with anybody, is I denounced those attacks against our Somali neighbors. And that was picked up not just in Minnesota, but around the country. And then, I was on alert and prepared and I actually am so grateful that I immediately deployed myself, if you will, to spend time with Susie. And then there was a couple of other ministers that I won't mention on the call, but I was told that as soon as that happened, churches began to be ready, on alert, passing out whistles. They were ready to be first responders in their community, showing courage in ways they hadn't before. So you can use your voice, you can use your writing, you can use your speaking. The other thing I like to say that's been shared so widely is that the power and importance of song and singing. We're seeing it be so effective in the Twin Cities for actions, disrupting and filling spaces with hopeful song that's also drawing us towards a more hopeful future. That's part of that nonviolent resistance movement that we know about from the civil rights, right? Cultivate more poignantly here with the songs of resistance. And just a shout out to all of you who've participated with those or are getting trained. There's a toolkit out now. And there is, yeah, I see, Susie, thank you. There's a toolkit out now. There's a songbook out now. There are more songs being created. It's really important to keep hope in our spaces when we're confronting violence and with the tactics that are being used from Border Control and ICE agents. It is debilitating. And with that, I want to shift just a little bit, Megan, to the emotions. So our leaders, our people, our members, the members of our community are feeling all kinds of emotions. We'll feel grief, particularly if someone close to us is snatched or detained, or in the case of in the Twin Cities, we've now had 2 neighbors who were killed protecting their neighbors. And that can take your breath away and feel like you're in the middle of despair. Our leaders who are on the front lines, who are our first responders, will feel exhaustion because they've been on for so many days. I think it's been about 7 weeks or so since we've been in the active phase of resisting ICE. Everything can feel overwhelming and urgent and feel like the only response is to be a first responder. And what I want to say is there's power in fast money and first responses, but there's even more power in slow money and people who are willing to step in and take the reins so that our first responders can rest. So I'm in my role as the conference minister. My job is to support, encourage, and resource and equip our leaders throughout the conference, and that includes all of our clergy as well as our lay leaders. So how do we do that, and how do we think about that? If you are a leader of leaders, you need to be thinking now and planning now for how you can help your leaders take time off, have respite, step away, give them permission to not be on every single day at every single march. When you have a broad network of people who are trained to respond, your key leaders can step away because they need to. If you are feeling too caught up in emotion, you're not effective in the response that you're given into the world. You need to coach, send somebody else in. When people are trained, you know those folks can step in. I'd say it's critical for all of us right now, no matter our role, that we have to take care of ourselves and take care of our emotional and spiritual self. So those spiritual practices that we talk about, you need to be actively engaging in daily so that you are ready and able to respond effectively when the moment calls you. My role, I see it, is that my job is to empower and encourage folks, but also to listen deeply and listen to what's missing and what's needed. So people who are leader of leaders also need to contact their resources and the folks that are available to support us. In my case, I've been in direct conversation with the general minister and president of the UCC, Karen Georgia, on multiple occasions to strategize about how we can resource and support our leaders here in Minnesota. And we're about to launch a 3-part initiative that I'll speak generally about, is to provide emergency grants to our leaders so that they can keep doing the work that they're doing and stop spending their own money. We want to we're going to provide something called clergy self-care salons so that folks can come and get some immediate care. And we're going to do those once a month. And then the third initiative is the long game, and that is I'm going to send out a communication to all of our churches and our clergy that we want you to go on retreat this year as part of your job. We want you to go away and rejuvenate yourself. And the conference is going to do its best to provide resources so that you don't have to pay too much money to do that. And folks are providing opportunity to provide their spaces so that that can be made real. And I'm working with another organization for some additional money to provide cost sharing for folks who want to go on retreat, and there needs to be some money paid for that. So if you're a leader of leaders, you need to take care of your leaders and make sure they take their time off and make sure that they have the respite care that they need, and you can put in the structures to do that. Part of what I've wrestled with, Megan, and you know this, is I've wrestled with, I'm not all the time one of the first responders. I'm not one of these people who's trained in pulling everybody together for a fast action, but I have other strategic gifts to give. And these are some of the things that I'm working on. There's something to be said for folks who understand we need to equip and encourage our people for the long game. This isn't going to be over tomorrow. Even though the rhetoric may suggest things have gotten better, they're not getting better. And so we need to take care of our leaders. Megan, was there something else that you wanted me to speak to directly?
I think, Tanya, that you covered a lot of it because you talked about some spiritual resources and with additions from other folks in the chat, which is really helpful. And then address how you are addressing despair and thinking about hope. And so I think that you maybe have something else to add to that.
Yeah, I just remembered. I want you to also know that you need to be open to the surprise. And what I mean by that is the good things, the connections that happen because you were willing to speak up, the surprise relationships that can form because someone was inspired by your willingness to lead or write or speak or be brave in your responses. And the second piece I wrote, which had in it the language, hold fast to love, hold fast to compassion, hold fast to justice. That got picked up by a professor at the music school in Berkeley in Boston, and was made into a song. And then that song was recorded and shared widely with all the conference ministers and all the conferences. There are ways that people will take what you give and turn it into something even more beautiful than you could have imagined, because you're willing to show courage. Other people will be inspired and show courage. The final thing I just want to say about that is it's really, really important that as leaders in our various communities, that we don't stop people from wanting to join us along the way, that we encourage them to do the good that is theirs to do. And for some, that's supporting their pastors. For some, that's providing cookies. I've seen on multiple occasions at our grieving sites, the memorials where Renee Good and Alex Preddy were killed, people are bringing food and soup and items to share to the mourners, the people who are coming to sacrifice their lives for their neighbors. Those people who are bringing that nourishment are doing the good they can do. And it's really critical to not think that what you bring to the movement is lesser than those who might be the ones who are kneeling at the airport and getting arrested. Everybody has a part to play. And that's what makes the movement strong, is that we all stand. In my case, I'm going to say this from a faith perspective, Megan, we all stand in our faith principles, in my case, Christian principles, that loving our neighbor is a commandment from Jesus. To love myself, that's self-care. To love God with all I got, and to love my neighbor above all other things, that is what I am called to do above all the other commandments. And so there is no question about my ability to show up inside of my Christian faith, because many of us have been trained in our churches to think that justice is a dirty word. And justice was always what Jesus was about. Jesus spent time organizing the people to resist an occupied nation. I used to wonder what it was like for Jesus to live in an occupied nation. I don't wonder what that's like anymore. And so I have to screw my courage to the sticking place and be willing to be a little bit more like Jesus and be able to stand grounded in my leadership and my ability to speak to this moment, because Jesus brought that clarity, that cleverness, that disarming ability in very tense situations to unmask the cruelty of the government and the religious regimes that he was in. And our work as people who are participating in this movement is to be able to unmask that cruelty for what it is, so that more and more people can see it and they can feel courage to stand in their faith and their convictions, to be able to say, I refuse to participate in this form of lifting up cruelty as a way of life. I love my community. I love my neighbors. I love my God. And I am going to have more courage and be brave, because I see all these other people having courage and being brave. The last thing I want to say is, I mean, it's you can't avoid the fact that I am in a car traveling from Wisconsin after we just got off the civil rights bus, and we were down experiencing firsthand from amazing people how they moved through violent state-sponsored actions against children, against adults, against our ancestors, siblings of color. And they had water hoses and dogs, and they did all these terrible, violent things that all of us are appalled at, right? It's the same tactics and methods that are being used now. It's dehumanizing violence against people and then crushing those who are willing to stand with them. So in some ways, we should not be surprised by the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the white observers, right? While our brown and black neighbors are the ones who are being assaulted on a daily basis. That is part of the playbook of our United States, is that if you are willing to stand up with your neighbors who are being treated cruelly, then we are going to make you an example of how other white folks shouldn't do this. And as we become more brave in our numbers and more centered in our nonviolent responses, the exposure of that cruelty will become more and more known. And I believe and know for sure that all empires do fall. All cruel empires will fall.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm smiling because I feel like we have on this call all of the elements that are part of this community building and grounding for organizing for the very thing that we're talking about. We have some amazing practical tools. We have experienced folks. We have folks who are more newly engaged and finding their way, and the incredible, fresh eyes that come with that. And then we have Reverend Tanya preaching up a storm and giving us some really good spiritual insights, and I think the spiritual like boost that we all that people who are coming from a faith-based perspective need for sustaining in this work. And so I thank you for all of that, all of those insights, Reverend Tanya, that you presented to us.